Welcome to our continuing series of virtual voices focusing on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Today, we have the privilege of having Mr. Martin Cadena, who is a biologist and a community manager specialist with more than 15 years of experience in government, nonprofit, and international organization. He currently works as an international consultant on knowledge management and facilitating global communities of practice on the nature and climate. Over to you, Mr. Cadena.
Thanks. Good morning or evening, everyone. As Dr. Durbak said, this is Martin Cadena. I work on sustainable development, and today I want to share with you a story of how the global development agenda depends on nature. But first, a big thank you for the invitation and to all of you for being here. I want to give you some context about our recent global development agenda. This story started several years ago in September 2000, when I imagine many of you were not born yet. World leaders came together at the United Nations headquarters here in New York to adopt what they call at that moment the United Nations Millennium Declaration, committing their nations to a new global partnership with the purpose of reducing extreme poverty and setting out a series of targets with a deadline of 2015. And these were known as the Millennium Development Goals that you have on screen. Now, moving fast forward to 2015, as you can imagine, most of the targets associated with the Millennium Development Goals were not reached. However, significant achievements were made, but the thing is that progress was uneven across regions and countries, leaving considerable gaps. Now, sorry, my next question is, what would you do if your 15-year plan for a better world is not complete by the deadline you established? In this case, the option of giving up is not available. So the only way forward is to learn from the process, its successes and failures, work together to make it better, and redouble efforts for the years to come. And that is exactly what happened. With a similar mindset, countries work to shape what I think you already know, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And with that agenda, new goals were adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015. These are the famous Sustainable Development Goals. Now, you have them here illustrated in the slide, and I would love to see if you can guess the name of the goals. Please try to type some of the responses in the chat box. In the meantime, I want to share with you some differences with the previous agenda, the Millennium Development Goals. So here we are talking about 17 Sustainable Development Goals with 169 targets that are broader in scope and go further than the Millennium Development Goals. The goals cover the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. Now, these are building on the success and the momentum of the Millennium Development Goals. And these new goals cover more ground with ambitions to address inequalities, also economic growth, decent jobs, cities and human settlements, oceans, ecosystems, energy, climate change, sustainable consumption and production, peace, and justice. And the new goals apply to all countries, whereas the SDGs were intended to for action in the developing countries only. So let me see, because we have, I was just reading through the messages. Thank you. I don't think anyone just trying to guess the names of the SDGs. Just let me uncover them for you in my next slide. So here, as I just mentioned, we are talking about eradicating poverty, also having, zero hunger in the world, having everybody on good health and well-being, having quality education, of course, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable energy and affordable and clean energy for all having the opportunity to have decent work and economic growth, with an industry, innovation and infrastructure, reducing inequalities, having sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production that is super important to achieve them all, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and of course, partnership for the goals. So as you can see, these cover all areas of development. They are interlinked, and this needs to be considered when implementing projects to advance on them. It is necessary to work on what we call integrated approaches, transforming potential trade-offs into synergies. So for example, a potential trade-off could be trying to achieve economic growth, on the cost of environmental degradation, for example, trying to achieve industry and innovation to the cost of seas and oceans degradation, for example. So, so far we have broadly explained the what, and now is the turn of the how. How do countries intend to achieve all that we have mentioned? Well, first, there is a clear framework to measure success. The 17 SDGs that you're looking at now have, as I mentioned, 169 targets and a global indicators framework. Countries are submitting national reports on a voluntary basis to show progress. And there are policies, coordination, and financial resources that are being put in place to favor the achievement of the SDGs. So it's a most robust infrastructure trying to push for achieving this global development agenda. Now, let's see if my video here works. What I want to show you here is, okay, how these 17 SDGs are indivisible. And what we're looking at here now, it's what it's being called the wedding cake, the SDG wedding cake. That is a concept produced by the Stockholm Brazilian Center, and shows just how the biosphere, meaning the SDGs 6, 13, 14, and 15, as a foundation of societies and economies, and as the basis of all SDGs. Such this kind of conceptualization adopts an integrated view of social, economic, and ecological development. So just to have a look on, a static look of this, it clearly, situates our SDGs on the that are pushing for, saving our planetary safe net. SDGs 15, 14, 6, and 13 as the basis for the rest on society, that is SDGs 1, 11, 16, 7, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5, and 2, and economy on 8, 9, 10, and 12, and finally for the partnerships. Just let me show you other conceptualizations of this. This is, you have the reference here. This is a really interesting current article that shows how, the different targets and their language, according to analyzing their language, are linked to nature. And the authors identified 3 different kind of relationships. Some targets are dependent on nature. Some others can be also harmful to nature if we continue business as usual. As I just mentioned a couple of slides ago, if you focus on economic growth with not consideration of the environment, how are you degrading the environment, you can definitely have a negative effect on nature, even if you're advancing on some of the targets of the SDGs. And overall, the overall evaluation is that most dependent targets can be beneficial of nature. Let me show you another conceptualization of this. So this is an illustration of the dependencies of the Sustainable Development Goals on nature-based solutions. And I'm gonna stop here and ask, why do you think this is important? What is the benefit, from frameworks like this? Just gonna pause a second to give you a chance to quickly react and think what can be beneficial for us in trying to conceptualize our current global agenda like this. Just to give you some hints, these frameworks are really putting nature at the front and at the center of the development agenda. They support us to find a route to achieve our goals without risking our life support system. There is a really nice cartoon that I like in the New Yorker that says, and I'm gonna place the link here for the cartoon at some point. I didn't want to show you because of copyrights, but the cartoon is there are three people around a fireplace, and one of them says, "Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders." So it's just a reflection on, what can go wrong when you do isolated and siloed approaches on the agenda. Now, let's, just quickly touch base on, I mentioned the concept of nature-based solutions. I just want to, reflect on a little bit on the concept. So we're talking about the nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainable, manage, and restore natural or unmodified ecosystems that address both societal challenges effectively and adaptively, and simultaneously benefiting people and nature. So the nature-based solutions address societal challenges through the protection, sustainable management, and restoration of natural and modified ecosystems, and benefiting both biodiversity and human well-being. Nature-based solutions are underpinned by benefits that flow from healthy ecosystems. They target major challenges like climate change, disaster risk reduction, food and water security, biodiversity loss, and human health, and are critical to sustainable economic development. So here is a really nice infographics produced by the IUCN with the concept, and also with some examples that we can, just to have a concrete idea of what a nature-based solution means. So it can be about the protection and or restoration of coastal ecosystems, the protection and or restoration and sustainable use of foreign landscapes, but not only on these kind of faraway sites from the cities. We can also have nature-based solutions in the cities, in the city environment, like urban green and blue spaces, and also on modified systems like agricultural systems, just going towards sustainable management of agroforestry, for example. So the next section of my presentation is about to showcase specific examples of how targets, how the goals and some specific targets are linked to nature. And let's just have a quick look on four. I think I put four different goals and some examples from each of them. And then we can finalize talking about, things that you can do, and also have a really good discussion on the topic. So let me start by, I selected the goal number 2, the sustainable development goal number 2, it is about zero hunger. And goal number 2 is highly dependent on nature. And, you know, as it aims to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. I selected a couple of indicators. One of them is the volume of production per labor unit class of farming, pastoral, forestry enterprise size. And another indicator is the proportion of agricultural area under productive and sustainable agriculture that are highly dependent on nature. They really increasing the quality of ecosystem services such as pollination, soil, water, and forest will have a direct impact on the volume of production and sustainable agriculture. So if we want to achieve the zero hunger sustainable development goal, we need to do it, you know, on considering that it's nature-centered, nature-dependent, and work with that in an integrated approach. Then let's move on to another example on SDG number 3. And this might not be, you know, as obvious as the previous one, but we're talking about here on good health, about good health and well-being. That is also, of course, highly dependent on nature. I selected the indicator that is about number of people requiring interventions against neglected tropical diseases. And just to have an idea, the increase that we are experiencing now and will experience in the near future in the global land temperature expected under the predictions of climate change can directly affect the transmission of some infectious diseases. The example I have, you know, it's not the one on the photo because we're talking about, if you're looking about a mosquito here, but the example I have is the Chagas disease that is considered as a neglected tropical disease. And it's caused by an arthropod vector of this, you know, they are arthropod vectors for this disease. And what is expected to happen is that temperature increase on the climate change would cause also an increase in the number of insects. And with that, a greater probability of infection of the parasite will affect, of course, in consequence, the transmission of Chagas disease. So we can expect more people getting the disease, and also on different latitudes as the insect range could expand under, you know, in an increase of temperature. Moving into another example, we're talking here about the goal number 8 on decent work and economic growth. And I selected a specific target here that is about the annual growth rate of real GDP, gross domestic product per capita. And this, the GDP, the famous GDP that all nations are worried about all the time, you know, just go up and up, because it relies, you know, behind that is the idea that the more GDP, the more income those citizens have. But that is a matter of a different discussion that it's not always true. Just to give you some data, according to the World Economic Forum, half of the world's GDP, I mean, really, half of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. The highest dependency, as you can imagine, is in the primary industries, such as food and beverage, agriculture and fisheries, as we just saw in a moment ago, and construction. And why construction? Well, first, because of the materials used, but also it has an effect on the real estate value. It's not the same to have a property with a view to nature, or with a view to the ocean, with a view to the next building. It has a real effect on the value of real estate assets. So another interesting data here is on the 2020 World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. Biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse ranked as one of the top 5 risks in terms of the likelihood and impact in the coming decade. So just to consider how dependent we are on nature. Let's move to another example. And here we have on the goal 11, that is looking for sustainable cities and communities. And I was just, touching base on this. The target that I selected is reduce deaths and people affected by disasters. And with disasters, you can think of nature-based flooding protection, flood protection, landslides, storm surge, sea level rise. And again, the World Bank estimates that disasters cost the global economy 520 billion annually, while pushing at the same time 26 million people into poverty. So this is just the dimension of the disaster. By the way, I have heard a lot the term natural disasters, just as a cultural information. There is no such thing as natural disaster. There is a disaster. Disasters are not natural, but that could be matter of a different conversation. Just to keep in mind that disasters are not natural, and it's caused by different variables, exposition, the risk, and how we can manage the situations as societies. Let's move into this that could be obvious, climate action, the SDG number 13, and just this goal also depends on nature. As an example, the indicator I selected is total greenhouse gas emissions per year. Again, as a reference to the World Bank, it estimates that there is a suggestion that nature-based solutions can provide a third, well, more than a third, it's 37% of the mitigation needed until 2030 to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement. In other words, there is no way to reach the Paris Agreement without this kind of nature-based solutions. So we need to consider that. At some point in my career, I worked on protected areas, and there is a difference between being intentional and not with nature-based solutions. For example, just to give you a hint on that, you can restore and in a protected area, and of course that causes a positive effect on biodiversity. But if you restore with a specific species that are native and are more prone to capture carbon, you're also delivering on climate change targets. Or if you protect or restore a zone that could be prone to landslides, you're also protecting communities on the valley. Or if you restore on the coastal zone, you're also protecting communities and supporting biodiversity and protecting communities inland from hurricanes and floods. It's like a buffer there. So it's even if the measures are similar to deliver biodiversity targets, when you're thinking on an integrated approach, they could be slightly differences that can help you to deliver on an integrated approach, and not just on biodiversity itself, but on climate change and on this case, disaster risk reduction. So by now, I imagine that you realize how important this global agenda on sustainable development, and how big is the challenge to transform our world into a better place for all in the next 8 years. And now what you can do, I mean, this is not a speech of I don't want to leave you with a negative message. On the contrary, I want to leave you with a hope, and also, highlighting this importance on how highly dependent we are on nature. And I just put some ideas here. First, what you can do is to treat more and disseminate the central role of nature to achieve all sustainable development goals. If you want to learn more on nature-based solutions, there is a global standard that IUCN created on nature-based solutions that I highly recommend if you want to know more. And there is another thing, maybe you are familiar with the red list. The red list is a list of species, endangered species, but at the opposite side of the red list, there is a green list for protected areas that is recognizing, well-managed sites, and it's kind of a green seal, a recognition of a well-managed site. And finally, my recommendation is for you to connect with different platforms like the IPBES. If you're familiar with the IPCC, that is, this scientific body that supports the Convention on Climate Change and, has been awarded with the Nobel Prize. The IPBES, it's kind of a similar body, but supporting biodiversity. It's the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and it's an independent intergovernmental body established by states to strengthen the science and policy interface for biodiversity and ecosystem services for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, the long-term human well-being, and sustainable development. It was established, just to give you some info, it was established in Panama City on 2012 by 94 governments. And it works really hard, and they have a really good, interesting reports on the use of biodiversity, the use of wildlife species, the risk of extinction, and a lot of nexus areas between biodiversity, water, climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And finally, this year, two big COPs are taking place. One is the COP on the Convention on Biological Diversity. It will be taking place in Montreal, Canada. And the other is the Convention on Climate Change that is taking place in Egypt. And I'm sharing this information with you because it will be interesting for you to connect to the preparatory process in your country on the CBD and the COP CBD and the COP on climate change, and just getting to know what is your country's position, what are they presenting, and what they want to achieve on these COPs. And there are a lot of young groups involved in these negotiations. They normally are observers. And they normally are, attached to governments or NGOs. And it will be interesting if you can connect with them and get familiar on how COPs are negotiated, how are negotiations within the COPs, and also to start looking at where you can, provide your inputs, your insights, your goal ideas. And with that, I think this is the last, just to remember three things. If I can leave you with three main ideas here. The Sustainable Development Goals represent a global agenda for a better world for all. Nature should be at the front and at the center of the SDGs implementation. And you and we can take action today individually with our work and as part of the society. So I will leave it there. I will turn it over to Dr. Durbak for her remarks and continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cadena, for a very interesting and informative presentation. Now, one thing, you're focusing on nature, But one of the biggest problems with trying to resolve the problem in nature is overpopulation. We have hit over 8 billion people in the world as of last week. And actually in 1960, we had 2 billion people. So we have been, how should I say, expanding the human population at 10 billion every 10 years. Now, of course, when we expand the population of human beings, then we will be destroying nature and we'll be causing more extinction and we'll be causing more destruction of the nature. So there seems to be a big problem with trying to adjust and modify the problems that we have in nature if we continue populating the way we are.
Definitely. You know, I see there is also several arguments on that. And it's also associated with the high inequalities we face. Of course, it's about numbers, but it's also about inequalities. When you have a small percentage of the world's population consuming resources equivalent to the half, probably the half of the poorest half of the population, we also have this problem of inequality. So I would say, of course, we have to attend that. We don't want to exceed our capacity in this world, but it's for me, it's also a matter of attacking inequalities, because we want all people have the chance to live properly with their needs attended. I will say this is a double challenge: one, on reducing inequalities, and two, on looking not to exceed the number that our life support systems can sustain in terms of number of people.
Well, yes, I agree with you. The problem is that until we can control the population so that people basically limit their reproduction to the children that they can feed, clothe, and educate, we are not going to be changing anything. And that is where the governments have actually done almost nothing. There's very little discussion about the fact that every child needs to have parents that can feed it, clothe it, and educate it. As a matter of fact, that's what I said at the 1994 conference in Cairo to the General Assembly. So that is completely ignored. And then when we're talking about the destruction of nature and the destruction of the habitats and the extinctions, how can we mitigate it? Anyway, other than the fact that this issue should be really more discussed and addressed by governments. Thank you very, very much again for the presentation. And I will turn it over to Susie, who is going to be asking a lot of questions that we have. Susie, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Durbak. Our first question from the audience is, to be honest, I just want the world to be a safe place for future generations. However, lack of water and resources will be a huge problem even in 50 years. I believe the benefit is that we can work towards sustainable development goals more effectively knowing all of these details. Do you agree with this statement, and what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Susie. There are multiple challenges of this. I have been invited these last 3 years to teach in a university about biodiversity policies. And one thing that I would like to start with is that if this world at some point was simple, or if our challenges were simple at some point, I don't think they were, but if they were, they are not anymore. So we're facing complex interlinked situations that need to be addressed in an integrated manner. And the challenge is that we have many countries are arranged their governments in a really rigid sectoral way. We have the Ministry of Environment that is not talking to the Ministry of Economy, that is not talking to the Ministry of, the Treasury, and et cetera, et cetera. So that is a real challenge. And what we need is to break those silos and just to look at this integrated approach. And what we are discussing now here is that nature can be that glue that, it's to be the central issue that can put on the table so every ministry can come together and try to find an integrated solution. So we're always pushing for these interdisciplinary approaches, not looking for easy solutions, not trying to make, what we have called maladaptation, for example, just to quickly put you in a direction of two challenges when you're trying to advance on this agenda, even looking from the nature perspective, from the nature lens. So we're talking about, we have been talking about fossil fuels and how we need to phase out fossil fuels in order to meet, our climate targets. But the other part of the story is that maybe the fossil industry is not, just staying there, and they will try to sell the oil for plastics instead of energy. So if you're not designing your solutions carefully, you will end, creating a new problem. So maybe you're reducing the use of fossil fuels for energy. You're considerably putting on the market unintentionally a lot of oil for plastics. You will be, flooded by plastics, and we need to think on all the aspects of the solution so we are not creating unintentional new problems. That will be my point, but it's doable. And there are a lot of examples that this integrated approach really works.
Thank you. Due to Russian missiles, many dolphins in the Black Sea are dying in mass. So what can we do so that animals do not suffer like this during such global crises?
Can you repeat it?
Due to Russian missiles, many dolphins in the Black Sea are dying in mass. So what can we do so that animals do not suffer like this?
Wow. Okay, so I'm gonna try to answer from my biologist hat and my heart close to tackling biodiversity loss. You need to be aware what you can do and what where are your limits. As individuals, maybe there is not so much we can do to, on these big conflicts that require a different approach, but there are a lot of things where we can take action. For example, just going back to the plastics issue, and at some point, one sentence that provoked really, the attention of the media was that at some point, I think it's 2050, it is projected that there will be more plastics than fishes in the ocean. So with that in mind, how can we, and I'm not just talking about the individual actions, but also we play a role, not just as individuals, but also as part of different organizations. How can we push for different policies about plastics and about microplastics? How can we push for, the other thing with the ocean and ocean biodiversity is that we are overexploiting fisheries. And, part of that is because we have a lot of subsidies. We're subsidizing fisheries, and that provokes, overexploitation. So I think in this case, you have to be aware of what you can do, and there are several angles to try to tackle the problem. I will say if we analyze it, it's not a no as a response, but if we analyze there is little we can do about the missiles and the consequences of, on marine biodiversity. What we can really do to avoid, this massive amount of plastic being, discharged at oceans and the sea. And second, how can we work together to repurpose subsidies from fisheries to the development agenda? And this happens with a lot of subsidies, not just fisheries, but I'm talking about agriculture and fossil fuels. There is a lot of money subsidizing these nature negative things that we need to first stop and then repurpose that, financial assets into the development agenda. I hope I can, provided some hope on that front.
Yeah, that was very insightful. What are your thoughts on preserving South African forests when trees are chopped down every day to grow sugarcane?
Excellent question. And then we're touching the development agenda is so broad. We're touching so many aspects of the development agenda and the biodiversity agenda. So my thoughts is sometimes we have what we call incoherence policies. And I can give you an example from one country when they have a well-established program that is payment for ecosystem services. And that basically pays you as the owner of the land to preserve the forest. But then you have another ministry who is encouraging you to expand the agricultural frontier, and they are subsidizing and incentivizing you to do that. So in the end, communities have to choose between, who's giving me more to preserve the forest or to go to the expanded agricultural frontier. So I would say this is just an example of many, that is a consequence of many issues. I would say if we can advance on policy coherence, so you don't have to choose between one incentive and the other coming from the same government, that is, one box that we can tick. The other is, just tackling the causes of we cannot put a prohibition on this if we're attempting to, if we're promoting poverty and inequality. Some people have to chop trees and cultivate for minimum for auto consumption. So you need to find the ways to not, not leaving people on poverty when you do these things. So I will say policy coherence and also tackling inequalities and also incentivizing programs for payment for ecosystem services can be, of use here. Yeah, for now. Thanks, Susie.
Thank you. How can we achieve the sustainable development goals related to world peace with a minimal impact on the environment? Do you think this is even possible or just a very ambitious goal?
Okay, so all goals have to be ambitious. Otherwise, there is no reason for us to having this conversation. So all goals have to be ambitious, and then they can push us to the limit to achieve this, zero hunger, eradication, poverty, peace for all. Some people might say that we tend to talk a lot and do a little, but I think conversations and offering the table for people to talk is where mutual understanding can start. So yes, working for also a point we didn't touch during the conversation, during the presentation, is the angle that I would like to answer this is how how can we tackle, how can we work towards peace from the nature perspective? Because a lot of conflicts will be because of natural resources scarcity. So no water, I mean, climate displacement. We're looking at those cases right now. We have a lot of people fleeing their homes because the land they are living now, it's not livable anymore. So I will, because I'm not a peace specialist, I will work through peace from the nature perspective, saying, hey, how can we avoid this scarcity to avoid conflicts? How can we provide people that are fleeing their homes because of climate, with solutions to avoid this displacement that is causing a lot of conflicts also, because we're talking about immigration and legal and illegal immigration. So I will take a look from the nature perspective and start working on these nature-based solutions that will allow to decrease and de-escalate conflicts at the local, regional, and global level.
Thank you. What is the role of an individual in the conservation of natural resources? In other words, how can we as individuals help achieve the sustainable development goals or partner with organizations and our employers to help achieve them?
Thank you, Susie. Really good question. I would say there are several things, and I can provide you with a tons of links and suggestions. I just provided a few in my last slide, but I can say some things. One is please be hopeful. I have worked in environmental education, and sometimes, at the beginning we were like doom and gloom, and that leaves people with no hope. And that is, I don't think that is the correct angle. So now we change that message and saying, hey, here is the dimension of the problem, and here is a list of things you can do. I would say, number one, you can say not everything has to be directed to achieve the big results. Not everything has to be, you need to pick garbage, tons of garbage to make a difference. Some things are inspirational. So if you, my number one would say, inform yourselves, because with that, you can avoid this type of actions that seems well-intended, but can have a negative effect. And you just remind me of a good anecdote that I want to share with you. When I was talking to a group of children, and I was talking about, birds in cages, and a little girl just had her hands up, and she said, you know what, to avoid these birds in cages, what I do is to buy them out and to free them. So I just smiled, and I didn't want to, to be aggressive. But I tried to explain that what she was doing is the opposite of what she intended. Because if she was buying the birds in cages, she was encouraging people to, capture more birds from the nature, put them on cages and sell them. And if you free birds in a different environment, the most, probably thing is that they will not survive. So first, be informed. Two, try to be a model of inspiration. Three, disseminate good messages across, your peers. Four, be conscious of your role, not just as an individual, but as a part of the society. If you work for an NGO, if you work for an industry, just ask what are these industry or NGOs nature social responsibility goals, and just be informed is the first step. Then try to get involved with these groups and suggest. And finally, I think a good point is to be active, to be part of the activist groups that are taking place now. There are a lot of activist groups, activism groups, climate change and biodiversity. And finally, you can, if you can pursue a career on that, that will be awesome. And also some internships with NGOs and international organizations in the matter are advisable.
That's really helpful. Thank you. How much does nature truly suffer from human interference, in your opinion? And do you think the pandemic has motivated global citizens to appreciate and protect nature more than they did before?
Okay. So questions are, and this is because of the topic, questions are, you know, the proper response to all your questions will require a little army of the specialists, but I will try to do the best myself. Okay, first part, how is our, you know, how are we affecting nature? Have you heard about some specialists are telling us that we're living in a different geological era now, that it's called the Anthropocene. And, you know, we can discuss about it. And even if you agree or not, the fact is that that concept is based on how we as a human species are shaping the planet, how we are the dominant species that is affecting the entire planet. So we're changing the planet's temperature. We're putting 1 million of species at risk of extinction now. That is the level, that is the magnitude of how we are, you know, transforming our planetary system. So just to have an idea, how we have affected nature, you know, in all ways possible, I would say, from, you know, extinction to introduce species, exotic species into new environments that have, you know, transformed into plagues, literally, to diseases that were contained in the forest, to, you know, polluting every single one, you know, aspect or territory in our world. And that is the size of the transformation we are doing today. Now, if we have the power of shaping the planet in that sense, I am also hopeful that we have the power to transform the planet in the opposite direction. Can you repeat this as the second question, please?
Yes. Do you think the pandemic has motivated global citizens to appreciate and protect nature more?
For some, I think for some, yes. Even we experience a decrease in greenhouse gases emissions for a small period. Now we're back on track. But I think, you know, the pandemic and in my case, the lockdown just remind me how important is nature to all of us. I need to see green every day to function myself. So I think we started to appreciate more the green spaces in cities, maybe to live out of the big cities in the suburbs and have this access to nature, because you can, in the lockdown, you cannot visit your friends, you couldn't visit your family, you are out, and if you're out, you want to be in contact with nature. I read an article, and some doctors are prescribing time in nature. I think in Canada, they are prescribing time in nature just to see how important these are for our well-being. So I think, yes, we started to appreciate it more, the function of nature because of the pandemic and the lockdown. But the thing is that we tend to forget really quickly. So, you know, just once this is over, go back and business as usual. And this should be the opportunity to reset things and to move in a different direction. Just reminding how, you know, a reminder for ourselves on how important it is to be close to green spaces and to be able to spend time in nature for our own well-being.
One person is really small in terms of account to change something, but all of us together can make an impact. So how can we humans be encouraged to cooperate with each other, even though we are typically used to competing in everyday life? The same holds true for companies and countries who are competing with one another. So how can we truly work together and save nature together?
Two things. One is small, yes, but it depends. Just try to get asleep in a room with a mosquito, and it's just one mosquito, right? And the other, I think the secret of that is to make community. So and this is also something that I'm aware. There are a lot of studies that show, and articles that I have read that show how individualism is encouraging consumerism, because what happens is that I am not related to anyone. I buy things and then discharge them. And if we're doing community, maybe I can lend some clothes to you, or maybe my children's clothes are not, they're not fitting him or her anymore, but I can pass it to the community for other children to use. They are practically, they are new, because children use the clothes 3 times and they're, they just run and pass that size of the clothes. So I think the secret here is trying to build community. And that will lead us to a different perspective on how we use resources and trying to make more impact. And the other thing is, we need everybody on board. For me, there are no enemies. You have to be able to talk to everyone and try to make your viewpoint on, if you continue business as usual, you're destroying the same system that is giving you the resources to continue your work. So if we don't change, and if we don't prepare ourselves to change, this is going to be really negative for you, for me, and for everybody. And also the other thing is, try to convince people to learn new things. Of course, if we change from fossil fuels to renewables, there will be people that will be left out of jobs. But if we start now, creating the capacities for those people to integrate to the new market, then I think we're doing in the right direction. So we're trying to diminish if you can call it, the losers of these transitions, and make it a more, just and equitable transition for everybody.
That makes sense. Thank you. In what ways do you think the annual UN Climate Change Conference helps member states, organizations achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay. One thing, just let me tackle this on several dimensions. One thing that the COPs do really well is to put the global attention on the topic. And this is good. Some can say this is more public relations than results, but the fact that every year the world is looking at you on how you're dealing with climate change, and climate change is part of the daily conversations, is good. Then trying to gently push for ambition to create this momentum is also good. And I mean, just, you have no idea on the armies and the preparation that it takes to go on a COP and try to put some positions and put for negotiations. So I think this is something that needs to be, encouraged, maybe more open to all, but it's necessary to advance on the agenda. There are 2 other COPs, so maybe the COP on climate change is the most popular, but let's remember that the Rio conventions are 3. One is on climate change, the other one is on biodiversity, and there is a 3rd one on the certification. And the 3, I think we need to tackle them together to advance on the Sustainable Development Agenda. There are other conventions on the pollution side, and just for your information, it's probably that there will be another convention on plastics. So things are getting prepared. If we're talking about the planetary crisis we're dealing with now, there are three, big planetary crises: is biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. And with these conventions, we're covering the three planetary crises. So they are necessary. I think it's a good thing that we have them annually. And I think they are pivotal to having these discussions and to measure progress on the promises we have had to tackle this crisis.
Thank you. Are there any books you can recommend to the audience members who want to learn more about the Sustainable Development Goals and other topics that you covered during this session?
Yes, but I think I prefer to send you a good list afterwards. So we can share. I would look at that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susie, and thank you very, very much for your presentation. It was very informative and educational, and the focusing on the importance of encouraging discussion on the relationship between peace and nature was just excellent. It is a very difficult and elusive goal, but I definitely think we should focus on it. Regarding your discussion about COPs, and I've attended some of them, I always send a delegation to each one of them. I think one of the biggest problems that they are not discussing is the small modular nuclear reactors, which certainly are not going to be used to produce plutonium like the RBMA reactors, but definitely can provide the electricity that many, many people need. And I never can understand why there's so little discussion about that. But again, Mr. Cadena, your presentation was just wonderful, and we very, very much appreciate it. I also want to mention that our next webinar is going to be with Sabina Cast, who's the principal in Global Strategy, Research and Innovation, and that is going to be on September 7th. And finally, Susie, thank you very much for hosting, and have a very, very good month. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.